Now, before we get into the panel, welcome everyone, trans and non-transgender alike. Um, Today you are going to be hearing a mess of information related to not only how transformation aligns with transness, but also what transness is and how is it seen within the areas such as trans studies, queer theory, queer studies, gender theory. I won't be going too heavily into those aspects. However, I did want to bring them into conversation so that way we could see kind of, okay, like at the level of academia, how does transformation deal with transness and vice versa? So let's go ahead and get started, everyone. For those who are joining us, I want to make it clear how we're developing this talk. I was questioning whether or not I want to do it like this and kind of give like a structure, but I think it would be helpful. For the talk, I'm going to be thinking about first transformation, what TF is, and of course, TF is so many things to so many people like transness. And so if you hear me explain TF in a certain way that doesn't align with how you see TF, just know that that's part of my own attachments and kind of where I come into TF. And of course, we could talk about it like when we get into the Q&A, how is it that TF like transness is very based in like our upbringing, attachments, and otherwise. And then we're going to shift into how transness as a concept aligns with TF and the way that we use it, whether in furry or the TF fandom or the brony fandom. And I think one of the best things that we have to kind of ground ourselves in this talk is that TF and transformation is an amazing medium for thinking about transgender. Whether it's about transition narratives that are euphoric, are negative, are a little bit messy and wishy-washy. We'll get into the bits and pieces with that, as well as look at some media representations and think about how those represent the wishy-washy space that comes before and against gender as we understand it. Now, to introduce myself, I've kind of lagged a little bit on that. My name is Juniper. I'm known quite often as the pig. I hold a doctorate in English and film and media studies and speculative fiction. I am currently a professor of liberal studies teaching the history and development of science fiction as a genre. And so my students this upcoming week will be reading Octavia Butler's Amnesty, and we'll be thinking about the ways in which the alien as this narrative trope, yes, has been used to think about difference, but how Butler, as a Black feminist, kind of reorients that to think about how difference becomes this starting point to new futures. Now, I completed my dissertation not too long ago and graduated. My dissertation was actually on the furry fandom. I wrote about how, furry as this eclectic, mixed and varied community pushes up against the idea we often have in culture when we think of fandom. And I actually press that scholars think of fandom in it's too stagnant. They don't really attend to the liveliness, the porousness. Case in point, in an article that I'm working on, I describe how fans who read the literature not only see it, yes, as a thing of fandom, but also, part of how we develop as communities, as societies. The cartoon animal is this way of thinking about better worlds and relationships. In terms of like persona and transformation, I predominantly identify as a pig, but I'm a polymorph, kind of going with my multiple trans identities. So I'm oftentimes like a seven-headed raccoon, a red dog balloon, a kinkajou, whatever I'm feeling. Lately, I've taken to being a tigress with like a 35-foot long prehensile tail. So um, by the time you see me, maybe earlier this week, I might be a different creature. Now, moving ahead, one of the things that I really loved growing up was transformation narratives. So I grew up on the southeast side of Los Angeles, living in a home predominantly of my grandparents. And we didn't have a lot of money for books. And I often read comics, played video games, because video games, had replay value. But also, we loved movies. And I really got taken by cartoons and the animate depictions that animation had of characters becoming something else or otherwise. One of my fondest memories is watching The Lion King and thinking that Simba eating the bugs from Timon and Pumbaa would actually then turn into an adult lion. I saw it as TF, not aging. I grew up on Mummies Alive, on Buzz Lightyear Star Command, all these great cartoon series with TF as a part of it. And no doubt when I got into anime and eventually furry, I loved shows like Wolf's Rain or Full Metal Alchemist, where there was TF, but it was a little darker and a little more character based rather than just a gag. And what I saw was that these transformation narratives were really this movement from one identity or perspective into another. And so you could think of films like Ginger Snaps, Daffy and Duck Amuck, where he's panicking as the animator or cartoon artist is drawing him as different forms. You could think of Beast in Beauty and the Beast, where the Beast monstrous representation is really this representation of him as a person, stagnant, holding on to this chip on his shoulder that he has. And when it comes to transformation media, there's a whole gambit. Oftentimes it's negative, and it can really think about disability, your humanity or lack of it, the stage in your life that you need to grow out of, or maybe something that you find yourself stricken with, like in the werewolf case, and you need to kind of shift out of that perspective. I don't know. For you all, was there maybe a series just in the chat that really stood out to you in terms of um, transformation media that really kind of spoke to you? So I help. I'm a fish. American Dragon, Jake Long, very good. That one's a great way of thinking about becoming a teenager, an adult. Same with Animorphs. Animorphs. Sure, there's this whole alien narrative, but also these children are at a stage of life where their whole world is changing, and we see that mediated through their kind of eclectic animal becomings. Digimon is one not a lot of people think about, but I remember Digimon Frontiers. You had an episode where the main character was kind of like this feline Digimon running through the city, panicking. Pokemon, of course, is terrifying as these kids get into their vices, they become animals. And so when we think of transformation, I want you to think of texts like these where, or at least in relationship to transness, we have a character who suddenly becomes something else. And the representation is trying to convey a certain message that comes with certain feelings, certain affect, as we would call it. Now, as I've kind of suggested already with Animorphs and Jake Long, or the American Dragon, these play off the cultural idea that the self is constructed within a particular space, and at any moment ourselves can change, we can transform, we can become new different people. I often joke with my partner and our friends that my various polymorphic forms are different moments of me. Whether I feel cuddlier, like a tigress with a long tail, I feel hungrier, like a pig, driven to my vices, whether it's video gaming, currently web fishing, or otherwise. But also, thinking about, the self as fluid. We're always moving. And to stagnate and hold to a simple identity really kind of errs towards majoritarian expectations. As trans folks, we tend to live more in the becoming and the process, oftentimes, rather than the exact determinate gender. And so, transformation, as I've shown with those various titles, kind of plays in that space in ways that resonate with transness. Now, one of the things that I do want to I want us to hold on to as we move forward is this idea of the monster. Very often, the unstable, and this comes all the way from the medieval period, the unstable body was saw as something you needed to stabilize through the humors, bile, blood, and so forth. And the monster is this kind of representation of an unruly body or subject that maybe became monstrous for one reason or another, or is already monstrous because of their instability. And I'm thinking, you know, um, Dracula and the Victorian era monsters were created as ways of representing national and imperial differences, and so they were seen as more unstable animal like beings versus Western human subjects. But in relationship to transness, and we'll get to it at the end of the panel, I want you to think about how is it maybe that the monster comes up in relationship to transness. And now I've been throwing out this word transness for quite a bit. Um, I think it's time to define it. So, as a scholar, I'm working particularly from Western transgender studies. Transgender studies in the West developed out of the 1990s as queer theory. This kind of activist driven field was looking to put pressure in literature, culture, the arts, and just academia writ large on the ways in which, normative power structures guide how knowledge is produced. And so you had Jose Esteban Munoz, you have, Susan Stryker, you have Lee Edelman, these theorists who, taking kind of the energy of the late 1980s and 1990s into the academic space, really kind of wanted to queer things, so to speak. But into the 2000s, trans studies, at least in the West, developed thinking about the ways in which gender is used as this anti feminist kind of form of power. You have people like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, the activists in the mid 20th century, but you also have Miss Major, Audre Lorde, Saidiya Hartman, and more, who were looking at the ways that gender as this categorization of bodies based upon certain attributions that are culturally and socially sustained operates in ways similar to race and other formations. And so trans studies is thinking not just about the ways in which power gets cemented with cultural logics and ideas, but also how subjects work within and against those very same structures. And so Judith Butler, in her text Gender Trouble, thought about how gender is performed. We as individuals go out into a cultural space, and because we want to fit in with those around us, we perform gender attributes in certain ways, whether for men that's more masculine, um, which itself is this cultural idea that gets performed in certain ways, or if you're thinking about cis femininity, you have cis women who are pressed to perform and dress in certain ways that limits them as individuals. Now, where transness comes into conversation is this idea that outside of the gendered structure that identifies men as men, women as women, and then these subjects have to act in certain ways, fit into society in certain ways, again resonating with race between whiteness and blackness. Transness is this almost activist pushing against those structures and choosing to live in the messier, murkier spaces that we call being. We're not necessarily determinant as individuals. Rather, we are agents choosing to inhabit certain languages, certain codes that resonate with us as we so choose. And so Marquise Bay thinks of it as a quote, setting aside the gendered architecture, like a house. And rather than choosing to be limited and excluded from certain structures, we choose to be anarchic, a little bit chaotic, if you will. And so that means we could think of the individual here in this space of transness as fluid, shifting, evolving, changing, and unwanting, not wanting to be limited in a certain box or category. Now, of course, that means you can choose your gender as you wish to be seen as, or you can choose to inhabit an identity of no gender or many genders, many selves. And so, transness, think of it as being like in this viscous fluid between those homes we call masculinity and femininity. Right. To Maggie, this cow's point, to each their own comes to mind. Rather than being limited, we're wanting to move into the space of I can be many things as I so choose to. I do not need to hold myself back and identify as one way or the other. Now, scholars have tried to describe transness and where it comes from, because oftentimes within culture, and Hill Malatino has this great book called Side Affects. I have it titled here, where Malatino thinks about the ways in which, if you're trans, oftentimes you are understood as feeling negative or bad or euphoric, because you're either in the space of I haven't transitioned yet and I feel horrible, or I've transitioned and all my problems are solved. And this is where Malatino says, that kind of anarchic sense, that anarchy that we trans people, almost like Nimona, like to live in, this ungovernability stems from the bad feelings we hold in trying to be ourselves in a society that wants to limit or hold us back. And so, um, rather than this binary, maybe we need to think of transness and why we identify in certain ways as stemming from negative feelings and emotions that come to us as a result of normative society and structures. And this is where Eric A. Stanley kind of puts a pin in it and saying it's not just that these structures are violent, but these are racist, anti-trans, and queer societies and cultures that, try to set certain bodies and individuals into certain categorical spheres. And so, if you read texts by Sadia Hartman, Zakia Iman Jackson, two brilliant Black feminist scholars, they talk about how trans or gender during the 18th and 19th century developed alongside and even with the development of racial sciences. So, thinking about the field of gynecology as it was developed and how gender really came from the wounding of the Black female body. And within this kind of consideration space, we can think about how gender is this mode in ways of violence. It is this trying to withhold the subjectivity of an individual by boxing them in. And so Stanley thinks of atmospheres of violence, that we exist as trans people in spaces of violence that causes us either to become little creatures or gremlins of our own, or to build our own care spaces and families that support us as we're trying to become who we wish to be. Yet on the other side, C. Riley Snorton, thinking, yes, transness exists in this world that wants to dominate and set us forth into boxes. But out of that, do we take up transness as this kind of invention practice where we choose our own individuality or even use the murkier, messier space of becoming and being as a sort of fugitivity? And so Snorton thinks about the ways in which Black folks during slavery use gender indeterminacy to move through society in ways that were acts of survival.
Hey there, Juniper. It seems we have lost your audio right there. I don't know if you could see chat right there. Uh, it is possible to disconnection or crash. Uh, well, I guess we're getting. Oh, Juniper.
Hello?
Hey, there we
Oh,
go.
hey, thank
Hey,
you. Sorry about
there we
that.
go. No worries, no worries. I just want to make sure that
Yep.
like if you didn't see in chat, that you could.
No, I
All
didn't.
right.
Sorry. Thank you.
No worries, no worries. Well, I'll let you. I'll leave you to it now.
Yep. So, just to go back a little bit, um, think of transness as this feeling or sense that the world is not perfect enough and that we as individuals cannot easily fit into what society deems of us. And so this is where kind of that anarchic, almost Nimona like sense comes from, where if society is going to see us as different, then we're going to take that and try to build better selves, better communities. Are we all kind of on the same page here? Or is there maybe a question that I can touch back to? I'm not sure when I cut out. So, to kind of wrap up this slide before we get into the juicy TF bits, a lot of scholars read being trans as existing within a space that is unsustainable, not only to those who are racialized and gendered in violent ways, but writ large. And to identify as trans is to choose to move about the cabin, so to speak, and find where we as individuals identify versus what society would like to impose on us. And so, again, this understanding comes from the idea that during the mid 20th century, um, feminists and Black feminists were responding to the ways that society limited women, Black women, Indigenous women, and so forth. And to be trans was to recognize not only that society itself is based on power, but also how the move to define one by certain traits is this kind of racializing structure. Now, this is where we get into the transness and such. I'm going to try to take a spin and get out of this bad feeling that Malatino thinks about, but to think about kind of, again, that fugitivity that Snorton describes in their book. Oftentimes, when I go to transformation fiction, it is because it is this powerful way of mediating me within the moment. This becoming that, can be drawn forth by something that I don't know. And it's easier to put that as magic. I am who I am because of magic. But then also, when I look to TF and kind of, there is that societal thing of like, you become a monster when you transform, or you become an animal, which is the opposite of the human, which you want to be. I think about the ways in which my own transition experience has been I'm becoming something else than what society expects of me. And so, in ways resonant with transness, TF kind of represents this becoming, this transformation and shiftingness that for some might be seen as monstrous, but for others, is this way of moving to new experiences, new ways of caring for myself that otherwise has not been done. And so maybe some days I do feel like a pig. Well, what does it mean to sit in that kind of hungry, self caring space versus the one that wants me to be, that cis heteronormative male that is human and doesn't get to have any fun, chomping at the bit, so to speak. Now, one of the things that I think is powerful within this frame of thought is in my research with furry, I found that for fans who saw TF as a narrative of their own, it really came driven by the 1980s and 1990s independent comic movement. So during the 1930s to the 70s, you predominantly had a lot of action comics, superhero comics, funny animal comics. And by the 1980s, the market was saturated with superheroes. But during the 1980s, you had an ability then for direct distribution, which was a distributor would pick up your comic and sell so many copies to an independent comic store that now took formation in America. And then artists who are not part of Disney, DC, Marvel could sell their comics and find their titles alongside, some of their heroes. And that's where you get a lot of work by Steve Galoshi, by Usagi Yojimbo's Stan Sakai. You would get where furry kind of bled out of the comics movement. But what's stuck around since then is this notion of using the cartoon animal, the anthropomorphic monster, and the comic to tell slice of life stories that really speak to an experience that can sometimes only really be felt. And so over the years, I've been watching as artists like Lake Hounds, Vanilla Yote, Glow Possum have used comics and transformation to think about transness. Now, Vanilla Yote and Lake Hounds in particular use TF as we know it to engage with questions of transness and becoming and being. But recently, within Glow Possum's Crossing That Bridge, while not distinctly TF as we know it, Elise's transition is this kind of transformative becoming, where you have a character who comes in to a text not knowing what her life is going to be like. And then by the comic's end, she's become a new person. And it is that kind of euphoric, I am now who I feel I am. And so well, that's kind of like on the side as like a TF/trans narrative. Um, to the artist on the left, transformation is this brilliant way of thinking about not only like theory and identity, but also the ways in which, trans becoming is a sort of transformation. Do we have any favorites here on the page? So I see crossing that bridge. And yes, um, one of the slide images at the beginning was a commission of me having taken raccoon HRT and eating Cheetos. Yes. And so TF and transness are not like new to each other. Um, some of the early comic works and fanzine works in Rao Brazil by Joe Strike and others were thinking about what happens when someone becomes an animal after being human and what are the positive aspects of that, not just also the stressful parts of it. But you know the more that I've thought about it, transness again is TF. We are becoming who we truly feel ourselves to be, whether that is, in the polar binaries of male or female, or we're trying to be this little creature, indeterminate between those polarities. But this is where also you can think about wider media representations and where transness or this kind of sense of becoming otherwise exists. So, of course, at the bottom, the most recent example is Nimona. So you have a character who became this magical being able to shapeshift because they wanted to experience life in the wild, quote unquote, beyond society and the institution. And as a result, able to live this colorful life that is against and in contrast the coldness of the institute and the urban space. They get seen as a monster. They get seen as somebody wild, uncontrollable, and our main protagonist has to kind of realize that what he's been taught about this outside world is wrong. And Nimona, as the film ends, recognizes that she's not alone, that who she is and special. But I love the playful moments where, on the left in the subway scene, we have our character saying, "Why couldn't you just be a girl?" And Gorilla Nimona is just like munching on old pizza, glaring at him like, "I'm Nimona. That's what I am. I'm just myself." Again, this kind of transness as this experience outside of what society and institutions want of us, but also working against it, pushing the boundaries. Now, the one on top is a little bit of a push. Has anyone seen Ginger Snaps? It was a Canadian film released during the 90s. Ginger Snaps is a werewolf movie. You have Ginger and her sister who love horror. This kind of, it becomes this feminist mode of placing one's own body in media agentially versus the representations of femininity that we often see. Women are supposed to be, cute. I just want to be saved and rescued. And yet these two young women depict themselves as gored up, violated, as like we are already gone into this other space. And what happens is Ginger ends up getting bit by a werewolf. And over the film's length, we're seeing from the perspective of Ginger's sister as Ginger seemingly becomes this hypersexual, independent, strong woman who is not wanting or willing to be victimized by the men in her high school. And while one could say that, the werewolf transformation makes her a strong woman, that question of monstrosity and the ways in which we can't understand Ginger's identity other than monstrous kind of opens up the space of transness of rather than, maybe she's not a woman, a strong woman here, but she's something else, something that we cannot describe as she moves from human to animal and kind of consume, well, she does consume men. And so again, that question of monstrousness and how Ginger breaks the mold of what is expected of women. And so while Ginger does not necessarily identify as trans in the film, there is that question, how is this in alignment with transness? And how does this, when we think of it that way, allow us to identify kind of the struggles that trans folk, trans women, trans men, non-binary folk have to deal with on daily? And so to kind of take away before we go into like questions and answers is transformation literature, it has a long history going to the medieval periods. And if you get a chance tomorrow to see Tofty's talk on werewolves, I definitely highly recommend it. But within the last, let's say, 30 or so years, artists have been taking transformation up as this powerful way of thinking about the self as not stagnant, as not simply male, female, abled, or disabled, but as one that's fluid, always becoming, always changing. And this is where trans people can find power in transformation literature. The self that we become, sure, might be an animal, it might be a beast, or it could even be this non-binary object. But then the question comes, what experiences come out of that? And how does that then open up new potentialities, new opportunities for living a life that is not necessarily beheld by those beyond our interests? And so trans identity, like TF, is not stable. It is capacious. It is many things. So I, again, think of Nimona. Nimona is many things, many creatures, and really gets to choose who they want to be in the moment. But also to kind of settle the talk, think about how transmedia and transformation media are important. In either case, for trans folk, these texts are important, and we should celebrate them more and come to recognize that while we may not understand, or while may some not understand what it means to TF and become a little gremlin or creature, these hold value, and they do actually become means of survival for many of us. And so I'm gonna kind of take a seat back and allow folks to ask questions if they want. Um, but do any people like really identify with this idea of like transformation as trans literature? So Victor Moore points out this really great concern, which is that trans masculinity gets overlooked. And trans mass people are not only like put to the side in media, but it's very much underrepresented in TF centric spaces. And entirely agree, both as a fan and as a critic. When we think of the trans experience and how it gets circulated within media and culture, it's often that masculine to feminine dialogue, right? And part of it, I think, is that the trans body is thought of as this odd, eclectic thing. And so the idea of men, particularly white cis heteronormative men, becoming a woman is much more sensationalist to culture. And so we see a lot more representations of that. We see a lot more people identifying transness in that way and ignoring how to be trans is to be many things. And there's so many experiences that get overlooked as a result. But if I go back to Lakehound's art, we do see trans mask representation. And so it's out there. But I think the question is how do we also have to have these discussions continuously as a community? And how do we then also have to challenge our peers and colleagues to speak more for trans mask folks so that way they like non-binary and genderqueer folks get their time. And so Maggie the Cow asked, did you know that it wasn't just medieval times that coined TF, but cases of transformation on that scale have been recorded as far back as ancient Greece? Yes. So I'm more of contemporary in terms of scholarship, but I think of all the time Ovid's Metamorphosis and like the Grecian gods and Zeus. And while it's not necessarily fully the same as TF media produced within the TF fandom, I think looking back and how it's used as this, how transformation is used as this literary trope or medium, um, can still hold resonance for us. I mean, one of the things I like to joke about with some of my colleagues who know I have a pig persona is like, yeah, I went to Cersei's Island and got turned into a pig, but I liked it all the same, so I just stayed this way. Yeah, to touch on Pascal the Otter's point, I think transformation is one of those like easy egg cracking um, representation strategies where we joke the meme is I feel funny when people see TF growing up, but there's that kind of almost embodied biological kind of experience we hold that occurs when we look at transformation media. Sure, there's the aspect where it's like, oh, I'm attracted to this. But for some, as like with relationship to trans folk or Therians, transformation literature can be this powerful way of giving someone access to a new facet of themselves that they may not have priorly recognized. That's one of the things, Worms with Teeth, that I do want to touch on. So, I myself am not a Therian. I understand some of it and recognize how this is a very important crucial component of not just furry but also transformation fandom. But the thing that kind of stops me is again, to align Therianism with transness from my perspective is to think about the ways in which someone is being themselves beautifully as they so choose to, and feeling something that exceeds our language. I cannot determine who you are or that you are human as we understand them. Rather, like an almost an animal. There's this great, hilarious but brilliant piece by Jacques Derrida called "The Animal That Therefore I Am." Derrida helped start off this field called animal studies by this piece, and Derrida, as a scholar thinking about the difference between humans and animals, wrote about how, in his apartment or home, he's standing there naked after a shower or something, and he sees the cat, and his cat is looking at him, and he's like, does this cat see me naked, or does this cat just see me as I am? And he leaves open then the animal as this kind of speculative space of with its own grammar, its own world that we can never truly inhabit, even though we ourselves aren't animals. And so I think that's where transness and Therianism really vibe with each other. There's this other space, this other experience that gets silenced or overlooked because of our languages. And, you know, in terms of how you align with it, in terms of gender, humanity, and such, I would say feel that out. See what the art and the representations and the literature kind of speak to you in that way. What other questions maybe do we have? Or um, is there something maybe I could speak more towards that I already spoke about? Excuse me, having my iced coffee. It is 7:43 for me. I need more coffee. EST time zone. That's a great question, Snyder. Um, when we're growing up and learning language and cultural norms, you could think of it like as a child, I wanted to run around with stuffed animals. I had a Mulan doll. I wanted to play with the little home structures that made it feel like, oh, I was doing the dishes or I'm cooking. We had an easy bake oven. And a lot of that stuff came because I had an older sister and we didn't get rid of that stuff. But as I was playing with these things, I was being told, no, that's not for you. Boys play with this stuff. And, I really kind of felt resistant to that idea. And to to think about like transgender transformation art, um, to become this opposite gender as I am understood by in the general public, is to become something otherwise that is more comfortable to me. Think of it like we have a sensibility as trans folk or TF folks. When we watch something, we read it with a different lens or experience than other people. And for some people, to see people become monstrous is like, I know what it feels like to transition and be seen as a monster. Or I know what it feels like to transition from one gender to the other and people to see it as a freak accident versus something that I personally wanted to identify as. And so, like, I grew up, watching anime, and there was that one anime where a cursed pond transforms somebody from one gender to the next. Somebody could probably bring up the title. Round my one half. Or, yeah, thank you. And I was like, how is that a bad thing? Like, how is that a curse, so to speak? And it's just the different sense of things that we bring to the media we consume. As a queer person, as a disabled person, I watch media informed by my own life experiences. And so watching Nimona turn into all these different creatures and then be vilified for it, I really resonate with that. Just scrolling back up, Schrodinger's, my dissertation is published. You would find it under the title. I can go back. Too far. Untaming Fandom, Funny Animal Figures in the Page Pace World of Furries. I paid for it to be open access for folks. And so if you are interested, feel free to look it up. The last name that it will be listed under is Lewis. Right, Chozo. A big thing of what makes queerness to me is like, wait a second, I actually want to be a dog and like chase male people. Like, I want to be this little radical creature. And let's see, going up, looking for other questions. Woodnote asks, what can people who don't work in academia do day to day to help fandom gender academics such as yourself? So academia is its own shit show, I will say. It's a mess. And very often, I have colleagues who do queer theory and trans studies go to these panels at like literature conferences and get silenced or overlooked or judged because of the material that they're working with. I've presented on furry numerous times and have had folks give me the stink eye or respond in ways that I wasn't looking for. Particularly at a queer history conference I spoke at, I was thinking about how um, furries comics at the turn of the 21st century allowed queer folks and black identifying folks to feel out what kind of futures and communities do we need to build to sustain ourselves. And one gentleman really kind of rolled his eyes at me. But in terms of within the community and the fandom, there's nothing really that you can do to help other than, keep doing your thing, document what you do. Um, some academics cite vlogs, some academics cite tweets. Um, just be yourselves. Victomorph asked me, how do you feel about the association between trans masculinity and werewolves that's been popping up? Now, I haven't really been seeing it other than Lakehound's work, this kind of becoming a trans masculine um, critter, canid. But I think the werewolf as this like representation, it's you become this larger than life, hairy, muscular body. But also you get this opportunity to show strength that dominant culture sees as monstrous. And I think for some folks that can resonate with people who are identified at birth as female becoming masculine, um, there's some resonance that can be had, particularly the soft, sensitive body turning monstrous, so to speak, quote unquote. Let's see. Trying to make sure I don't miss any questions. Ba, ba, ba. Okay, scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. There was one question here asked, um, do you have any recommendations for books that you'd recommend for after you've had kids? Let me make sure I had that correctly. Yeah, resources for transitioning when you already have kids. I don't personally have any resources. If anyone in the chat has recommendations or websites with that information, I highly recommend it. However, I do have some book recommendations if you'd like to know more about transness and trans history. And so we have C. Riley Norton's brilliant Black on Both Sides, thinking about how trans identity exists beyond the typically glossed over white narrative experience that took on during the 1960s forward. And so again, Snorton's thinking about the ways in which blackness and transness resonate as this identity like experience that gets put into categories and boxes. Marquise Bay has a book called Essays on Blackness and Cisgender that kind of builds off that steam, so to speak, thinking about the way that blackness and transness are limited by cis identity, because cisness is oftentimes thought of through white heteronormative patriarchy. Susan Stryker's Transgender History is a great book for those who want to learn about some of the history of transgender identity. And then a really great book, if you really want to get into trans studies, is the Transgender Studies Reader. Um, this was a book that really pressed trans studies into becoming a thing around 2006. And it's a collection of essays that these editors have put together that show all the different ways in which transness was coming into discussion within the academy from the 1970s up into 2006. And so some of these books, of course, are going to be academic and might have terms and ideas that are difficult to parse. But I highly recommend them if you really want to get into trans studies and use them to think about media in different ways. Now, I am almost out of time here, alas. But I also want to just close with, you know, one of the beautiful things about TF art is that, like transness, it is an individual experience. And you are, as you are looking at literature and media that speaks to you, I hope you take away that your transformation, so to speak, is your own. There is no normative way to become trans or be trans. Your body and identity is always fluid, always changing, even down to the level of like microorganisms. And so in a way, we as humans are already fluid beings. Um, in that case, also celebrate the artists who create these works. Write fiction, do what you feel really empowers you as a trans person, but also think of transformation as more than just a becoming something else. But before I go, do we have any final questions? Yeah, so I see the titles for those books are put in the chat. House Pets, I would say House Pets is a great comic. There is this long narrative arc where characters who are human are starting to transform into animals, and one character, Marion, transforms from a cis male into a female squirrel, and their partner transforms into a male bobcat. But with that said, I think I'm gonna be done here for tonight. Thank you all so much for listening in, for checking this out. I really appreciate it. We have 60 people in here. My gosh. What I also want to say is if you want to find me at my more furry spaces, Deep Space, not swing, swine, like pig, Deep Space Swine is my blue sky there. As well, Princess of Party is my Twitter. You can add either one of them. I still use Twitter, but thank you all for checking this out. Take care and keep transforming, folks.